Hi, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here for today's talk by an old friend, a colleague, and now the chair of the AM Khwaja chair at Jamia Millia, Professor Shahid Amin. Shahid and I have known each other for a very long period of time, and as with all relationships with Shahid, these can be turbulent relationships because there are times when you get along really well with him and have the most wonderful conversation. There are moments when you say, what the hell is Shahid thinking about? Which we think about all the time. But more to the point, I mean, I was just remembering a conversation, I was mentioning this to Mukul a minute ago, a conversation that I had with Shahid as I think I was walking home from the mess in St. Stephen's College. You know, Shahid has a way, if you know him, there's a way of sort of gathering you up as you're walking by the crook of your arm and taking you off to a corner and suddenly whispering all kinds of things in your ear. And so as a young undergraduate, he gathered me into a corner, into a bush. Shahid's dad sort of liked me on most occasions. So Shahid knew me, so he gathered me and said, you know, this Irfan Habib's book has come out. That book, you shouldn't read the text, you should just read the footnotes. So of course, like most mystical knowledge, you know, I filed it away and I said, I have to go back and take a look at this book, and I just read the footnotes and you know, you have to, I don't know if any one of you have ever seen this famous tome of Irfan Habib at St. Stephen's College Library. It actually doesn't exist. It's a Xerox copy. It's a Xerox copy which has had the scribbling of people over generations along just the footnotes. And I wonder if it's Shahid sort of masquerading with different pens and that got in there. But the reason why I was mentioning this is because Shahid has this unique ability to actually collate information. He just gathers information as he goes by. It just clings to him. And more than other people, he's able to make sense of it in ways that will elude us. And I think that's why historians always say, well, Shahid is an anthropologist, you see. He does this. He picks things up and he'll make these connections for you, which are quite amazing. But that's one part of Shahid. The other part of Shahid is just his craftsmanship. I mean, Shahid is one person who will gather this empirical data, and then for the longest time, he'll sit and mull over it. And he'll weave an argument that will stand the test of time. I mean, it's an argument that people will go back and refer to many times over. It's an argument that historians will mull over and learn from. So when you see his work, you realize that this is not just sort of random discovery. This is careful thought that's gone into just the craft of history writing. And I mention all of this to you as a preface because I think I heard an early version of this lecture years ago.
10 years, 11 years.
Yeah, as is one, 10, 11 years ago. Shahid had an earlier version of this paper, and it was the most engrossing paper back then. So you're in for a feast. This is a lovely paper. It's on Delhi, but it's a Delhi that Shahid knows intimately. It's a Delhi that Shahid grew up in. It's his backyard that we'll be talking about. And for many of us here, as I see them, I mean, it's the backyard of many of our youth as well. This is the area in and around Delhi University, and it'll start off from there. And I have a lot to do with that. So, welcome to all of you, and I'll pass the mic over to Shahid.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I start with throat clearing noises, let me just draw your attention to this. This is the plaque at the entrance of the main gate of arts faculty, which is kept shut all the time except it's opened on the day that Duta elections take place. And you can see that the name of the Vice Chancellor has been kind of not erased but laid over by a ramp to enable disabled people to gain entry. And this Vice Chancellor is no ordinary Vice Chancellor. He is the ex-Chief Justice of the Federal Court, 10 years of tenure of Vice Chancellor, has got 3 places named after him in Delhi University: Goyar Hall, Maurice Nagar, and Miranda House. Miranda was his daughter. So this is a plaque, 1948, and I've kept it as a kind of play on the word term past remains, because actually this plaque was put as foundation stone after the building was built. And that was because, for some reason or the other, unaware of what would happen to bloody Delhi in September 47, they dug the foundations of this building in August 47, and then left it at that, because there was murder and mayhem, murder in Timarpur, mayhem in Delhi University. The big 8-room house of the wardens of the roads of Goyar Hall was burned down, and its occupant, the first professor of history, Aij Qureshi, went to the High Commission of Pakistan and then straight to Pakistan, as happened with a lot of Muslims at that time. So this then is illustrative of how the past remains. It's not been erased, but another functionality has taken over from the announcement of the building. So I just wanted to begin with that. Time was when it was great to be a historian, especially a social historian. Eric Hobsbawm said something to that effect in the 1970s. It seemed that for people of my generation, Rushdi's midnight children, handcuffed to history, it was the age to flex our wrists, if nothing else. A whole world was opening up: affordable paperbacks from Penguin Books, translations of classic historical texts from other European languages, especially French, a new way of writing about the past. This was the time when history writing began opening its aperture to etch the lives of ordinary men and women, those little-known purveyors of goods and services, not producers of documents, the people without history. Whether Bob Dylan eventually delivers the Nobel lecture in Stockholm and collects the money, he's got exactly 1 month to date. The times, as with it our pasts, are a-changing. To be a card-carrying historian in today's India is akin to being a licensed practitioner of one of the trades of ill repute, and if nothing else, a dealer in hazardous material. I stand here today as more than a habitué of India International Center. I'm here to honor Abdul Majid Khwaja, BA History, Cambridge, a fervent nationalist of the old school, founding member and second vice chancellor of Jamia Millia, Islamia, who took over that position from the redoubtable Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar and handed the baton to the educationist and future president of India, Dr. Zakir Hussain. It's an honor to be holding the A.M. Khwaja chair at Jamia. As a small offering, the Urdu term Kharaj-e-Aqidat comes to mind. As a small offering, I propose to talk about somewhat a different kind of history, the sort that does not exclude practices of memory from its list of approved practices, as the historian theorist Partha Chatterjee put it nearly 2 decades ago. In a recent book, I have tried to spin a historian's yarn about the intercalation of the pillage and violence associated with Mahmud of Ghazni and his virtual replacement in popular memory from Ambala to Azamgarh by his fictitious nephew, warrior saint Ghazi Mian. In my lecture today, I propose to explore some key moments, both visibly documented and vividly remembered, from the life and times of our beloved and benighted Delhi, the venerable Hazrat-i-Dehli. The year 1857 and 1947 mark major cataclysmic breaks in the political and social life of our city. The year 1957, when our currency went decimal, is not momentous by any stretch of imagination, unless one makes allowance for entering the memory palace of a 7-year-old, tempered by a historian's awareness of times other than his own. So what I offer today is a clutch of stories based partly on the archives, where facts are kept alive with care and attention, and the life of streets and roundabouts, forever hostage to municipal caprice and the power play of our elected representatives. My first memory of Delhi is tied up with the partition that took place before my time. My father, who had studied at Aligarh Muslim University during the heady 1940s, had been dispatched by his mentor to teach medieval Indian history at St. Stephen's College. In July 1957, when the nation state was 10 and I barely 7, we moved into a small ground floor flat at 10 UB Jawahar Nagar, the site of the Nirula fast food outlet servicing Kamla Nagar and Delhi University till a decade ago. Piquantly called the Retreat, it was a nondescript house built in the late 40s or early 50s by one Mr. Puri from what had become Pakistani Punjab. The adjacent vacant plot awaited construction and was used for a bit of open-air badminton in the evenings. 2 houses away, at the site where a somewhat seedy Ajanta restaurant was to come up and survive till the mid-1980s, was the most outlandish house of Kamla Nagar, for its time, one must add. It was decorated in plaster with images of gods and goddesses and had cemented pot flowers affixed to its 2-storied balcony. It had even its side walls decorated with mythological scenes painted and affixed in cement. As another building in the adjacent vacant plot came up, these frescoes got walled up. Such building extravaganza was rare in the Delhi of the mid-1950s. Mohalla gossip explained it by the owner, a bookseller in pre-partition Punjab, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Punjab, receiving fortuitously a sackload of high-denomination notes instead of a consignment of books from across the Wagah-Atari border. No outward signs distinguished us as Muslims of small-town Uttar Pradesh. But there was a clutch of 6 or 7 years olds the next day peeping at the Musalmani who had moved into the neighborhood. It was the bathroom badhna, the aluminium ablutionary lota with a spout, that had given us away. The cleaning lady had made sure of that. To be sure, it was one of those signs of quotidian difference that had singled the Hindustani Musalmans out for a couple of centuries, a marker of the same order as the differing appellation for the dry lentil urad, mash, the use of the wooden ladle doi for preparing dal boiled in water, or the preference for copper over brass vessels, for that matter. A rural glossary of UP defines badhana as a water pot usually made of copper or earthenware with a spout, deriving it from the Sanskrit Vardhanika, the Buddhist sacred water vessel. Earthen badhnas were commoner in rural areas. By the late 40s, the cheaper aluminium had made its entry into the kitchen and bathrooms of middle-class Gangetic Musalmans. 6 centuries ago, in 14th century East Bengal, peasants used to hang a badhana from their rooftops of their thatched huts as a marker of him having converted to Islam. It is ironic that the word Buddh, idol, is derived supposedly from the image of Buddh. Buddh. The badna of North Indian Muslims had its base as well as its spout in a Buddhist sacred vessel. Indeed, in East UP idiomatic expression, the badna came to denote figuratively a constant companion, as in the phrase, wo usme shamil badna the. Further, in Bhojpuri and Avdi ballads about the wondrous exploits of Ghazi Mian, the humdrum badna, the vessel that enabled the proper ritualistic ablution preparatory to prayers, could for that reason be transformed into a prison house for demonic adversaries. To get back to that very ordinary mid-50s aluminium badna of Kamlanagar, the one that gave us away as Muslims 60 years ago. Bemused at this quotidian curiosity, there was nothing to worry about. It was after all 1957, not 1947. My mother brought me out, a 7-year-old with at best an unsure grip on a water-filled badna, to play with children belonging to the Garua or the unmarked brass lota culture. Sons of Sharnarthis, fugitives fleeing the Punjabi Muslims of Pakistan, this was their first encounter with a UP Musliman resident in the midst of Kamlanagar. Cautiously celebrating the Pact of 1923, engineered by C.R. Das, the man unsurprisingly behind the name Chitto Park, cautiously celebrating the pact between Congress and Muslim League in Bengal, the great Bengali poet Nazrul Islam had written caustically, Batna garute gale gale lage, nab pakter ashnai, Musalman hater nai churi, Hindur hate bashnai. Rhyming ashnai, which is love, with bashnai. 35 years later, unmindful of the childish wills of 7-year-olds, Badna and Garua were indeed hitting it off in post-partition Kamlanagar. Kamlanagar of the 1950s was of course very different from the high-density shopping center that it is now. But so are Delhi University campus and the adjacent ridge transformed places. In the heart of Kamlanagar was, and still is, the Gujar village of Chandraval, unseen for the most part by the merry shoppers of today. In the 19th century, Chandraval was a sprawling village which stretched from the ridge to the Jamna. Nursing a grievance at their lands lost to the redoubtable Thomas Metcalfe in the 1830s, the Gujar villagers had sacked Metcalfe House, in 1857. Even till the early 60s, I remember, bus conductors stopping at the IP College bus stop were known to holler, Matka House, a sprawling estate to this day. It is the site of a massive set of labs and offices belonging to the DRDO. It is believed, writes John Kay in his monumental history of the Sepoy War, that there was a peculiar feeling of animosity against the Firangis in connection with this edifice, Metcalfe House. It was said to have been erected on a land formerly the site of a Gujar village, and that Gujars had flown upon it, eager for its demolition and resolute to recover the ancient holdings on the first outbreak of mutiny. And there's another story still more significant. The building was originally the tomb of one of the foster brothers, it was said, of Emperor Akbar. It had been converted into a residence by an English civilian who was murdered, and the act of profanation had been vainly appealed against to another civilian who afterward shared the same fate. And here it is worthwhile to quote at length from what William Sleeman had to say about Matka House. I quote, "The magnificent tomb of freestone covering the remains of a foster brother of Akbar was long occupied as a dwelling house by the late Mr. Blake of the Bengal Civil Service, who was later barbarously murdered at Jaipur. For those who have read the great novel Kai Chand The Sare Asma by Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, will remember the murder of Blake in Jaipur. To make rooms for his dining tables, Blake removed the marble slab which covered the remains of the dead from the center of the building against the urgent remonstrance of the people, and threw it carelessly on one side of the wall where it now lies. The people appealed in vain, it is said, to Mr. Fraser, the Governor General's representative, who was soon afterwards assassinated. And a good many attribute the death of both to the outrage upon the dead foster brother of Akbar. Unquote, Sleeman. The pillage of Matka House by the Gujar villagers of Chandrawal was thorough. It kind of just destroyed everything, burned the famous library, etc. I'm not going into the details. Metcalfe House was a wreck when the British returned to the ridge on June the 11th, after having been thrown out of the city a month earlier. A month had passed since the outbreak in Delhi, and the sack of Matka House, and the rebels had established a formidable battery there, which played upon the left of the British position on the ridge and the Flagstaff Road. The historic name Flagstaff Road lasted till 12 years ago, when it fell to the idiosyncrasies of a truly nonsensical road name-changing decision. More on this anon. The victorious British confiscated the village and sold it off as plots for bungalows in civil lines. Some of these picked up by the Rahusa, plural for Rais, who had sided with the avenging force. The villagers, for their part, was made to move further north, where post-1947 they were hemmed in by the state-sponsored colonization of partition refugees of Kamlanagar. As late as the mid-1980s, the Gujars of Chandrawal would herd their cattle past the Institute of Economic Growth to lay claim, so to speak, to their lost grazing grounds on the unkempt western lawns of the Delhi School of Economics. A large village with a checkered career under early colonialism, Chandrawal by the early 60s was an Abadi besieged. Both the increasing commercialization of Kamlanagar and the spurt in student population on the adjacent campus had created tensions between a historic village and its changing post-colonial surroundings. Deep in the bowels of Kamlanagar, Chandrawal was a no-go area for most of us 1960s adolescents. In our youthful, febrile imagination, this was where drain-pipe dadas squatted all day long on string charpais, emerging ever so often to manhandle the undergraduates queuing outside the seedy Robin Talkies in Ghantaghar for a Dara Singh Mumtaz thriller. The major social event on the campus, the inter-college cricket final, was another occasion for the Chandrawal youth to take on the inadequately matched Delhi University stuffies. In Delhi, at least, the town-gown conflict was one between a beleaguered village and university students as it played itself out against the backdrop of a fast commercializing mohalla, very unlike Oxford and Cambridge. The pull of the university was evident in the shops that started coming up in the 1950s on that part of Bungalow Road that connected the side entrance of Hansraj College with the back gate of Karorimal College. There were a string of bookstores beginning with Khosla Brothers, who largely stocked used university books and solved and unsolved Delhi University examination papers. To this had been added a couple of publishers of what was loosely called Orientalia. The more famous of the two, Motilal Banarsi Das, had and still has its headquarters there, while Chaukhamba Prakashan was a branch of the Banaras publishers. Richie Sports were suppliers of sports goods to the university, and the half dozen colleges on the campus. Musica was a not so good but ready at hand store of Western pop music. And ending the series was the Coffee House, run by the All India Coffee House Workers Association, the chain that introduced both dosa and coffee to Delhi in the late 1950s. Abutting the coffee house were two small shops of a tailor and a bookbinder. Both were unassuming establishments and refused to sell out when the consumerism of the 1980s started transforming not just this street or the rest of Kamlanagar, as indeed it did large parts of Delhi. They were finally demolished around 2005. Weighed in at the two corners of the road on either sides were pan shops, which stocked the entire range of cigarettes, from the loosely packed, unfiltered Charminars to Scissors, Panama, Passing Show, the fraudulent filter-tipped cigarette without an actual filter, but a portion color to look like it. There was of course the staid capstan, which was beginning to lose out to the aggressively marketed Wales Navy cut made for each other. The turnaround on this road from the mid-1950s has been, to say the least, remarkable. The betel and cigarette shops have remained, but the cigarette brands have largely changed, with the takeaway pouch pan and zarda mixes supplanting largely the Desi Panarsi variety of organic pan. Khosla Brothers has turned into the United Colors of Benetton, with an Airtel outlet next door. Richie Sports now functions as an authorized outlet for Reebok shoes. The Adidas shop is close by. Musica has finally yielded to yet another upmarket branded sportswear showroom. Publishers of Indology and Orientalia survive, but there's a big Archie's gallery selling its eponymous cards and vanity gifts. And Domino Pizzas, the US-based fast food company that guarantees home delivery in half an hour, has moved to challenge our own Narula's 10UB, where my parents and I had moved, Badna and all, in the summer of 1957. The transformation in the last 15 years has been even more rapid. For now, there is a large-scale tearing down of houses and shops built in the 1950s, and a greater capitalization of land value. The construction of basements and customized glass-walled postmodern shops and eateries. Fast food shops, branded sports and casual wear outlets dominate this part of Kamlanagar. Inside the main market, an odd flour mill still survives. The old chemist Mr. Sethi's United Pharmacy still does a roaring business at the Chota Gol Chakkar, but Vinod tailors and Kela dry cleaners have disappeared. And the Bajaj General Provision Store now sells numero uno clothes. A sibling has retreated with the original Kirana shop into the bylane. Greater capitalization and commercialization has brought newer boundaries of both separation and surveillance, and a reduction in the public's right to weigh. The back gate of Karorimal College, the shortcut entry into old Kamlanagar for two generations of university students, is now closed, walled out in effect by the multi-storied Bindal garments and numerous cars that its customers arrive in. With the curtailment of the shortcut through KNAGS for short, is no longer accessible by foot to those living on the university campus. But then a lot of undergraduates now live in KNAGS in what is called PG accommodation. Iron gates have replaced wicket gates, hedges and low fences in all the colleges and in the main universities. Page number 2 to 4. Yeah, so this is now to the main temple in Chandraval. Manchanga, it should be Kathauti mein Ganga rather than Katoti mein Ganga. Next. Now this is another shop. You see, Vrat ke liye doodh ki thandi bottle, and you have got Bisleri, and you've got various, this is one of the main shops there. Next. And this is Bindal, this is Burkos. This is a huge hoarding. So this is what Kamlanagar is like now. The eating habits of the denizens of Kamlanagar and those who frequent its eateries have no doubt changed. There are far more non-veg, as they say, fast food items now than was the case till even 15 years ago. There is even a somewhat expensive Mughlai outlet, a franchisee of the famous Kareems of Jama Masjid, on the quaint stretch of road leading to Kamlaganj and Malkaganj, where a low-income municipality maternity home sits cheek by jowl with a polyclinic and now even an upmarket CT scan center. But there's no butcher shops in Kamlanagar. These are to be found in the Dalit and Muslim Basti, a small and densely populated patch beyond Malkaganj on way to the old Sabzi Mandi, where a much reduced number of potters still work their wheels. And shops selling pork, a low-caste diet, and mutton, both of the halal and jhatka variety, still carry on a brisk local trade. No one from Kamlanagar, and very few, if any, of the more cosmopolitan university teachers buys meat from these basti butchers. Kamlanagar residents may eat hamburgers and even kebabs, but outside their homes. This seems to be related to the fact that most people living in Kamlanagar are part of larger joint families, which tend to block an easy carryover of changed dietary preferences into the family kitchen. To that extent, some of the pre-partition Khatri Arya Samaji preoccupation with dietary purity and sattvic food survives in the average Kamlanagar joint family kitchen, but not outside, be it in restaurants, in nuclear family homes away from the prosperous refugee colony, or at non-veg friends' homes. Next. This is a shot from the Flagstaff of the ridge when there were very few trees, they have cut it down, and these are the tents which are now this is August or July, September 1857, and that is Jama Masjid in the backdrop. So this is from where they were to launch their battery assaults onto Kashmiri Gate and blow open an entry into Shah Jahanabad, the gated community. So this is a very rare. You can see that it's been taken from a height, and it's completely, Pradeep Kishan is here, and he will remind us that you see very little of Kikar over here, which really is a much later import onto the ridge by the British. The northern ridge, which runs from Mall Road along the university and then past Hindu Rao Hospital, the Tughlaq Shikargah, the Ashokan Pillar, the Mutiny Memorial, descending steeply into what was the old Sabzi Mandi, has, as they say, witnessed much history. It is now feeling the impress of a long present. This was where the British, driven out of the city in early May 1857, encamped briefly and then returned with their siege train from Punjab in June. There were 10 natives for every European in camp on the ridge and the camp, which is where now cavalry lines, bungalows and houses are. In every troop of artillery, there were 4 times as many natives as Europeans. In the cavalry, 2 men for every horse. Without them, the work could not go. I'm quoting K, History of the Sepoy War. K pauses for 3 pages in his fast-paced narrative of 1857 and the account of the siege of Delhi from mid-June to mid-September to consider the plight of these native camp followers on the northern ridge by the university. He paints a sympathetic picture of the native cooks and water carriers who, unmindful of the well-directed artillery fire of the rebel topchis and golandazas from nearby Mori Gate, had played khidmatgars to the besieged sahibs at the Flagstaff and the northern ridge. K pauses to ponder over the quote-unquote causes of this fidelity and suggests that it was perhaps the accustomed domination of the English, quote-unquote, and the lure of regular pay which made these natives disregard, quote, the national aspect of their struggle, unquote. The more important part of this relationship, however, was the unchanged attitude of the master towards the servants, even under vastly changed circumstances. The demand of humanity, implies K, suggested that the English be slightly more considerate towards their native camp followers, without whom the project of the reconquest of Delhi would have been quite impossible. But it was not just the exhaustion caused by war, the increased, quote, hatred against the colored races after the news of the Kanpur massacre, for instance, that had made the life of native camp followers, quote, less value than that of the meanest animals. That would be to take an anti-historical view of the relationship between Europeans and Indians, emphasizing, I suggest, contingent factors to the exclusion of well-entrenched structures of domination. And if colonial domination had to be re-established, then insensitive as it may appear to some, that structure could not be dismantled during the very campaign for the re-establishment of British supremacy. I quote K again. As arrogant, as intolerant, and as fearless as ever, we still closed our eyes to the fact that our lives lay in the hollow of the hand which we so despised. Even in the midst of disasters and humiliations, which would have softened and enfeebled others, our pride of race still upheld us, stern, hard, and immovable. And though it is impossible for those who sit deliberately on judgment upon such conduct towards the subject people not to condemn it, this appearance of strength was strength. It's the midst of our weakness. A contemporary satire, on the other hand, published in the Urdu Delhi Akhbar, had lampooned the harassed English gathering at the Flagstaff, called Jamia Angrezi Bauta, the gathering at the Flagstaff. It talked about अंग्रेज की अकल की टोपी और खिरत का पतलून, खिरत इज विजडम, अपनी जगह से खिसक कर मोज़ाए घबराहट पर चला गया है. And it went out to poke fun at the inability of the rich force to raise the wherewithals from hostile villagers for an immediate frontal attack on the city. But going back to K, the distance between the white man and the black man, which was the site of the operation of colonial power, was still there on the narrow strip of northern ridge between the Flagstaff and Hindu Rao's house, even if the field over which this power could be exercised had been severely reduced. Next. This is a photograph taken by Beato in, say, September, October 1857 of Flagstaff. We are fortunate to have pictures of the rage as it was in the autumn of 1857. There is a absolutely fantastic book edited by Narayani Gupta with photographs taken by Jim Messelis, which juxtaposes as far as possible from identical vantage points photographs of 1857 and early 2000. The Flagstaff is very much as it was in late 57, except that it had then only a solitary midget of a tree where the road forked right towards the Chauburja Mosque picket. Now it's still called Chauburja. The road was called Chauburja Mosque. Now it's called Acharya Muni something or the other. I'll say more on road name change. Now next, this is Chauburja Mosque, which is if you climb up from St. Stephen's Hindu College up the ridge, when you reach the plateau, this is on the left-hand side. It had four, intriguingly more than three domes, and you can see that one dome has gone off, and today this was the receiving end of the bombardment from the rebel position in Morigate, and so today there's only one dome left. In Beato's frame, the mosque picket, as it is called, emerges from a desolate nowhere, scarred by the damage suffered in the decisive push towards Kashmiri Gate. 3 of the 4 domes that gave the mosque its Chauburja name had withstood the pounding of 1857. The photograph shows a mihrab of its doorway casting a neat patterned shadow in the sun. In the foreground are 3 faceless natives, 2 wearing kurta pajamas with a headgear and a wrapper on their shoulder. A bare-legged diminutive figure in the middle, flanked by a European. Perhaps Beato himself suggests Messler's because you took a long time exposure, so you could be present in the photographs. In riding breeches, leather boots, and solar topi, contemplating a handheld object in bright sunlight. The ruins of the Chauburja loom large in this dry and desolate photograph. Over the next 100 years, 2 additional domes collapsed and the middle section of the gateway also fell through. Now partially restored, this 2-floor single dome structure, rare 2-floor mosque, is part of the reserved forest called the Kamla Nehru Reserved Forest. Interestingly, a lot of place names in and around this area were after Nehru's family. Roopnagar, Rooprani, Kalmanagar, and of course Jawaharnagar, where we stayed. It was from this picket and other batteries on the northern ridge that the British had made their decisive assault on Kashmiri Gate in mid-September 1857, and then onwards to the city, the fort and Humayun tomb, where Hudson captured Bahadur Shah Zafar and brought him back to trial and eventual exile in Rangoon. Next 2 photographs. This is from a book on Delhi, and this is, as they say, time pass by subalterns who are making cartoons and other things while waiting for the final assault of Delhi. This is the redoubtable and famous Bakht Khan, the commander-in-chief from the Bareilly Brigade, who is strutting around, and then in response to the golas coming from the Flagstaff, he's just running away with a little pandy with his tail around, and it describes the scene. Next. This is intriguing. This is another. These are medals and ribbons for the medals which were sketched by soldiers while waiting for the assault on the city in the autumn of 1857. You can see the British lion getting the better of the Indian bug, and there is a person being strung there, and some kind of a little animal being denied any oxygen after that thing comes through. And these are the ribbons, and this says Delhi. So there was some light entertainment obviously going on if you are sitting there for as long as you did, for 3-4 months. Now, so they move to next slide. Next. This is the Kashmiri Gate, and this is people say that this is a worked out because there a lot of skulls have been just sprayed over there to create effect. Live skulls of people actually. Next. Now this is a photograph that I'd like to talk a little bit about. Now a World Heritage Site and one of the best maintained of Delhi's monuments, Humayun's tomb in Beato's sepia composition stands testimony to an Indian past firmly lodged, shall we say, in its ruins. The long shot catches a relatively small tomb in the distance with an oversized pockmarked dome. The majestic gateway of today appears detached and almost unnecessary. Bits of low walls, a solitary kikar tree, and 2 small puddles from a late autumn shower all combine to give the place a sense of, shall we say, oblivious vulnerability. What a sad and ludicrous place for Bahadur Shah to have repaired to after the fall of Delhi. Beato's photograph seems to be telling us. What a waste of time and effort before the march of colonial history. Next. This is another very rare, interesting photograph. These are taken from the Al-Qazi collection of the gardens of Humayun tomb as they look east. And you can see the river at the backdrop.
What's the date?
These are all 1857-58. Beato, the great photographer, had covered the Crimean War and then comes and does a huge number of photographs of Delhi and Lucknow and so on. To return to the northern ridge, this rocky waste of Beato's photographs had in the next 100 years been planted with shrubs and kikar trees. In the late 50s, it was quite a wild place, not safe to venture into after dark. Small thieves would disappear inside its dense foliage. Hare, foxes, jackals, and peacocks routinely crossed the deserted University Road and darted across St. Stephen's and Hindu College. Till the 60s, there was very little construction on the ridge, just the 2 water reservoirs near the Flagstaff and Hindu Rao Hospital. The 80s saw the ridge under attack. Roads were widened to carry the thorough traffic from the ring road to the burgeoned residential areas in model town Gujranwala and beyond. The footpaths were gobbled by widening motorized roads, such that it is now positively hazardous to walk up the ridge. Early morning walkers from Kamlanagar and localities beyond now drive up the ridge in cars and then walk the flat stretch between Chauburja and the Flagstaff. Next. Now this is the entrance. If you climb up from the university main gate, after about 40, this is a big establishment on the right hand side. And this is the Siddhapit Atm Dham Shri Madhav Prasad Ashram's Tapovan. And so this is part of the, and this is a 3-story building, which is both a kind of a multi-facility hospital as well as, psychiatric, in help in natural environment. And I'll show you why I say the next. Now this is where you keep your shoes when you go for consultation, and this is Brahmarshi Acharya Pravargir, and these are all the degrees, MA, MPhil, Vyakran, and then he does everything. Gems, so these are for keeping your shoes. As this is all part of the reserved forest near Delhi University. This is 90s, yeah. So this is just 30 yards up from the main gate opposite the main university gate on the right hand side. A large area was swallowed up between the university gate and the Flagstaff by a double-storied Sankat Mochan. I don't have to now describe this. And so now the ridge is of course protected, but there are far too many alterations. Gravel footpath, fancy non-functioning waterfalls, airsats, lakes, built structures for forest officials. In fact, there is a kind of a saligram strewn pathways, and there are signs saying Ganga, Jamna, and Saraswati. So the entire thing is worked out on the ridge. The northern ridge is now a veritable park, obviously with all modern facilities to relieve yourself and such other things. It's called the Kamla Nehru Park, of course. In a bid to canalize early morning piety, Rule 3 on the billboard next to the Chauburja requires patrons to feed bananas to the monkeys only at the Delhi University gate. Next. Now, bandon ko khane ka saman, this is laid out. This is by the university gate. The designated area is cordoned off with a big notice. Except expectedly, both the feeders and the fed are less disciplined lot. The entire uphill climb from the university gate to the Flagstaff is littered with banana waste and crisscrossed by yelping monkeys. Only the habitué of the ridge dare take this road up the Flagstaff, where a helpful vendor now sells walking sticks and small canes to show the animals away. Over the years, the monkeys have multiplied, the hare and peacocks have understandably disappeared. Now, the historic Flagstaff is an unprotected building, badly in need of repairs. It's a big place for morning walkers and so on. But the Flagstaff Road is no longer called Flagstaff Road. the Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee came to inaugurate the memorial at the place where B.R. Ambedkar used to stay on Alipur Road in 2001. Alipur Road, which has been now called Shamnath Marg, was closed because of metro construction. So the Prime Minister could not reach the house of Ambedkar where he lived. So it was taken up by a side road and appropriately renamed it Baba Ambedkar Memorial Marg. So the Flagstaff Road, which is not where Baba Sahib lived, which is in fact where there's an ancestral property of Salman Rushdie and the residence of the Chief Minister, is now called Baba Sahib Ambedkar Memorial Marg. So if you walk up the Flagstaff Road, past the Flagstaff and descend, you obviously land at the old Viceregal Lodge, from where Viceregal authority has been exercised now for a good many years by various CEOs of the university. The character, location, some quaint details about Delhi University and where it's not a marcia for Delhi University. Let me say that it's just what happened in its pre-puberty days. The character, location, and development of the University of Delhi bears the impress of the major milestones in the life of Delhi over the last 200 years. The site of the campus was literally the camping ground for the victorious British who entered the city in 1803, pensioning the figurehead Mughal king. It was here that the main camp of the British besieging force was located, hence the name Cavalry Lines, also known as G.C. Narang Marg, because G.C. Narang practiced law in Lahore, but he's got a house over there. It was again here that a makeshift tent city sprang up, Mughal fashion, in 1903 to celebrate the coronation of Edward VII as the Emperor of India. And when a substantial edifice was constructed on the rocky land, it was to accommodate the Viceroy Curzon during the brief period of state-induced festivities. The present administrative hub of the university, which houses the offices of the Vice-Chancellor, narrowly missed a kingly sojourn. The edifice was kept ready for George V and his empress to move out of the royal tent just to the north in case of inclement weather. The weatherman kept his promise, and the king simply stepped out of Kingsway camp to the imperious Delhi Darbar of 1911 and made the momentous announcement which was to transform the reduced city of Delhi once again into the capital of India. That the new capital would soon have its own university seemed inevitable. But how soon? And what sort of university? This was the result of the concerted efforts of three existing colleges: St. Stephen's College, founded 1881, Hindu College, 1899, and Ramjas College, the redoubtable Ramjas College, the most recent addition, which was started in 1917 on an extensive site on Anand Parvat overlooking the Sarai Rohilla railway station. These three colleges represented distinct moments in the city's encounter with colonial modernity. By contrast, Delhi College, the oldest, was still suffering from the consequences of its forceful opposition to the British in 1857, the year of the Great Ghadar. The college had its origin in the madrasa started in the Sarai during the reign of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. As the star of Delhi and the lesser Mughals waned and that of Lucknow rose, the fledgling institution received the very substantial endowment of 1.7 lakhs from the Awadh officialdom. In the 1820s, English, mathematics, and science were introduced, and the college played an important part in the Delhi Renaissance of the 1830s and 40s, helping translate literary and scientific classics for the Urdu reading student population and the walled city civil society more generally. All this changed suddenly during the catastrophic summer of 1857, when individual Englishmen, including those serving the college, became the target of generalized attack. In the aftermath of that unsuccessful revolt, the victorious British summarily tried and shot dead the most noted Farsi scholar of the time, Sheikh Imam Bakhsh Sahabai. The college, for its part, was given over to the police lines. It was not affiliated to the university, so when the Delhi University came into being, the college was still a school. And it was again received, it was at the receiving end of huge partition violence in 1947, and M.M. Beg, the principal, wrote a special letter to Humayun Kabir asking for a grant of 2 lakh rupees, and also saying that we have been teaching 500 refugee students from NWFP and Punjab, despite the fact that the college virtually is completely destroyed during the September riots. And of course, there was St. Stephen's College, about which less said the better. It was these, which was, what do I say about St. Stephen's College? I better not say something about Hindu College as well. Well, St. Stephen's College moved into Kashmiri Gate in 1899, and that was the year when St. Stephen's College moved from Chandigarh to the colonial enclave of Kashmiri Gate, next door to, of course, to St. James's Church. It was at that very year that leading Delhi mercantile houses and prominent citizens, and perhaps the leading good trader of the city, appropriately called Gurwala, at a remove from Bada Sahibs, laid the foundation of Hindu College on May 1st, 1899. With a part-time honorary vice-chancellor and with the faculty, the registrar, treasurer, and director on loan from the colleges, the university for most part of the 1920s and 30s was not quite a freestanding structure. Vice-chancellor was Sir Gaur, who was practiced law in Madhya Pradesh, in central provinces, and he was a part-time vice-chancellor. And next, for the next 20 years, it kept on moving. Of course, it was originally planned to be located around Curzon Road as a part of the new structure. But then it was thought that it would be just too expensive. And then things started to use the old Viceregal Lodge when it gets vacated into Delhi University. And by 27, it was clear that the old Viceregal Lodge, once the Viceroy moves into Rajpath or on Raisina Hill, was be given over to Delhi University. A detailed proposal about the Viceregal Lodge, and it was a huge area going all the way to almost to Vijayanagar and Model Town, the entire area. And that's how there is a university polo ground next to the police lines, far, far away from the main university. So there was a detailed proposal to make the Viceregal Lodge fit some of the requirements of the university. And interestingly, in 1927, there was a committee set up consisting of the then Vice-Chancellor, the Chief Commissioner, and the Chief Engineer, A.M. Rouse, after whom, of course, Rouse Avenue is named. And this makes very interesting reading. According to the committee, the old Viceregal estate could be roughly divided into 5 areas. The central area covered about 75 acres. It contained the Viceregal Garden, the main building, the Prince's Pavilion, which is where Vijayanagar starts across the Ganga Nala, and certain residential quarters and subsidiary buildings. The committee recommended, to give one example, that, quote, 11 rooms in the European servants' wing could be converted into residential quarters for the staff. The Dhobi Khana, without much difficulty, could be converted into either a gymnasium or a swimming bath, for which purpose the large furniture and tent go down could be found suitable. What is more significant is that the transfer of the main part of the old Viceregal Lodge was put on hold, for the imperial government had decided in April 1931 to commandeer the dwellings assigned to the university for trying out the Delhi conspiracy case, and had actually set up a Delhi conspiracy commission under the same Punjab regulation which allowed courts to try protesting prisoners in absentia. This goes back to the Bhagat Singh. And there hangs the tale of the incarceration of Bhagat Singh and associates in the wine cellars of the old Viceregal Lodge, whose tasteful renovation 12 years ago has drawn all-round applause in the city and media. The trial of the 14 accused in the Delhi conspiracy case, with conspiracy to commit murder and with other arms and explosive offences, started in the main block of the old Viceregal Lodge on 15th April 1931. Bhagat Singh had been hanged 3 weeks earlier in Lahore on 23rd March 1931. What then accounts for the lasting belief linking Bhagat Singh and the empty wine cellars of the Viceroy, inherited and restored, alas, not revamped, by the University of Delhi? That the same criminal procedure Punjab Amendment Act rushed to speed up the trial of Bhagat Singh was made applicable to the 14 Delhi conspirators. The issue was similar: whether an accused in custody who willfully absented himself as a political statement could be tried in court in absentia. That the special commissioner tried the second case almost immediately after the trial of Bhagat Singh. And of course the fact that the terrorists, quote unquote, accused were brought regularly to that vacant Viceregal Lodge and then taken back to Delhi jail for the 21 months that this unsuccessful trial lasted. Could they have not spent at least a couple of nights in the wine cellars or kept change there for the duration of the luncheon recess? Perhaps. There are, after all, two crammed privies on the same level as the wine cellars. The relevant file, EHL Lands Education, July 252B, is not available, not transferred in the National Archives. What we know for sure is that on 25th May 1932, Rudradat Misra, Dhanvantari, K.B. Gupta, B.R. Gupta, S.H. Vatsayan, Azad Vidyabhushan, Vishampayayan, and Bhagirat Lak Harkesh, among the accused, sent a petition from the old Viceregal Lodge, Delhi, to the Viceroy in his summer residence in Shimla. And one of their complaints was that the heat-repelling Tati screens had not been placed on the windows of the lorries that ferried them routinely between the old Viceregal Lodge and the jail in the dead of the insufferable Delhi summer. That's the proof we have. The conspiracy case was finally dropped in February 1933 as untenable. 4 of the accused were let off, and the rest were to be tried individually for severe acts, overt acts. The University of Delhi could now move into the old Viceregal Lodge. So let us do an autocorrect. Let's skip Bhagat Singh, for God's sake, and begin associating the unfamiliar political terrorists, Dhanvantari, Rudradat, and others, with that historic site. What is the lesson of history for this, as they say? There are sundry pasts that tend to remain, each laying its persistent claim to our collective present. Willing a particular past into existence is a favorite sport of a particular kind of politically conscious class. It appears that, as with so many other remarks of India, Marx was certainly wrong in what we could do with our past. Recall his famous remark, "Men make their own history, but not as they please. In India, we do things differently. Here we go about making history just as we please." What does a retired historian like me and a good many of us on active duty do while plying their trade, as it is serially diminished by the diktatwalas of various bhavans, sadans, pradhikarans, and ayogs? One time-tested way is to keep acting as erudite whistleblowers, wrapping the purveyors of newfangled histories and freshly woven and fabricated past on the knuckles for having got their facts wrong. This is, of course, is necessary, and it has its uses. What I've tried to suggest with the Bhagat Singh story is that historians also try to explore how memory plays on the similitude of fact. Questionable as it may appear to some of us, one feels like breaking into a bit of mongrel Urdu verse and declaiming तथ्य के आगे जहां और भी हैं, अभी इश्क के इम्तिहां और भी हैं. I'm afraid I've gone on and on, leaving myself hardly any time to talk in any meaningful way about the event of 1947 and its afterlife in our city. The key dates here are, of course, September 47, when riots wrecked central Delhi, and the way Gandhi seems to have felt the bloodletting by his fast unto death. He broke it on January 18, 1948, in response to the pleading of a very curious and motley delegation led by the President of Congress and comprising, hold your breath, the representatives of the Hindu Mahasabha, the RSS, the Jamaat-ul-Ulama, prominent Muslims of Delhi, along with the city administrative officers, the redoubtable Mr. Randhawa, and the High Commissioner of Pakistan. 12 days later, Gandhi was shot dead. For people of my generation, it was the anti-Sikh riots of November 84 that bloodied the spatial contours of our imagination. One result has been the birth of new writings, new histories, and newer fiction that Delhi has Delhi as an important location for the events of 47, to use a parallel anodyne phrase. Events of 6th December, events of 47. The key work here, of course, is Urvashi Bhutalia's The Other Side of Silence, a new kind of engaged oral history. The writings of historians Gyan Pandey and Wazira Zamindar, and the Delhi section of Mukul Keshwan's Looking Through Glass. So powerful is Keshwan's evocation of the riots within a kilometer radius of where I speak, that every time I pass the Masjid Nursery and route to Pandara Road, I can almost sense a slain body as the first victim of the killings that spread from Lodi colony. And then there is the heart-rending testimony of Delhi autumn 47 and winter 48 in the cool yet painful recollection published 30 years later by Begum Anis Kadwai, Azadi Ki Chhaon Mein, about which I'll say something in end. An account of the relief work among the camps of Hindus and Muslims displaced by the independence of the subcontinent. First published in Urdu in 78, Hindi translation 2000. It is also available in a translation by Aisha Kadwai, now in Penguin. But let the photographs taken of the camps, 16 se 22. Let me just read it. Let the photographs taken of the camps, the refugee camps, by the official photographer of the Press Information Bureau in 47 speak of those harrowing times. Photographs which defamiliarize such known places as Purana Qila and Humayun's tomb, belonging to our city, but to its most harrowing past. Next. So these are official photographs. This is the Humayun's tomb displays, where a lot of the population of the city of Delhi lodged and then took the train to Pakistan. Next. This is Humayun's tomb. Next. This is another view of Humayun's tomb camp. Next. This is refugees from Pakistan women learning a craft. Next. Children in Rambagh. Next. An old dictating his claim to a professional writer. Next. This is photos, record room of chief of claims. Next. Khatam. I'm just going to end now. I wish to conclude by honing in again to a place very near the IIC, the Shah Mardan Karbala Qabristan, which periodically consumes newspaper space and results in police bandobast, closure of the Jorbarg metro station, and friction with the residents of the BK Dutt colony and the owners of the nursery that abuts it. Anis Kidwai has this very interesting discussion about how she goes over there, and there are Sharnathis from Punjab who have come into Delhi, and they have occupied the big Karbala ground, which obviously has lots of graves, and they have dug open some of the graves, and they are living over there, and she's trying to argue with them. And then as she's going out, her car tire gets entangled in a charpai and breaks it. And the charpai is all that they had. And I'll just read bits of it. It's very nice Hindi translation by Noor Nabi Abbasi. The Urdu is excellent. So, and she's very apologetic. ड्राइवर को डांट कर मैंने गाड़ी रुकवानी चाहिए, वरना शायद कोई और हादसा हो जाता. वो घबराहट में आगे बढ़ा. गुस्से में बिखरे हुए मर्द औरत हमें, पंडित नेहरू को और कांग्रेस राज को कोस रहे थे. वो क्यों ना कोसते? हम में से कौन उनकी मुसीबत में काम आया? और इस बर्बादी के आने में किसका हाथ नहीं था? उन्हें देखकर मुझे खुद ही अपने हाथ खून में लिथड़े दिखाई देने लगे. उस वक्त उनकी इकलौती चरपाई जिस पे वो रात में कुछ देर तक गाफिल होकर सो रहे थे, यहाँ की सारी दुनिया भूल जाया करते थे, आंखों के सामने उनके टूट गई. उनसे मुंह छिपा के जाना मेरे लिए गवारा न था. मैंने माफ़ी मांगी, अफसोस जाहिर किया और मरम्मत के लिए कुछ रकम पेश की, जिसे कम महसूस करके उन्होंने लेने से इनकार कर दिया. इतनी बड़ी रकम मांगी जो उस वक्त मैं दे न सकती थी. मैं पहली रकम पे ही अड़ी रही. मामला तो तय न हो पाया, लेकिन बातचीत से वो ज़रा ठंडा पड़े. जब सारी इमारत देखकर हम वापस लौटे तो फिर सहन में लोगों ने हमें घेरा. औरतों ने आगे बढ़कर मेरे कदमों में बच्चे डाल दिए कि ये मर रहे हैं और तुम इनकी कोई परवाह नहीं करती. हमको मकान दिलवाओ, हम कई महीनों से यहाँ पड़े हैं. औरतों ने चिल्लाकर कहा, ये मुसलमान हमको बहुत सताते हैं. मैंने कहा, बीबियों, यहाँ मुसलमान तो कोसों मीलों दूर तक बाकी नहीं हैं, तुमको सताने कहाँ से आ गए? कहने लगी, हाथ हाथ भर के लंबे सांप निकल निकल कर डस रहे हैं, कितना बूढ़ा बच्चा मर चुका है. मैंने हैरान होकर पूछा, तो मुसलमान क्या सांप हैं? और फिर मैंने काफ़ी देर तक उनको समझाया, उनकी गलती बताई कि सैकड़ों साल की पुरानी इमारत और कब्रों को छेड़कर तुमने खुद सांपों को दावत दी है. इन्हीं में सांपों के घर होंगे. उनके मकान खुदे तो तुमसे बदला ले रहे हैं. मैंने उन्हें ऑफिस का पता दिया और कहा, शांति दल को अर्जी दो, वो तुम्हारी मुश्किलों में मदद करेगा. मकान भी उनकी मदद से मिल जाएंगे, लेकिन किसी वक्त फिर सोचना कि तुम सब ने कितना बुरा काम किया. इमारत ना बर्बाद करते, उसी में रहते, तो कब्रें तुम्हारा क्या बिगाड़ लेती. इतना हिस्सा अलग रहता, बाकी ठिकाने तुम ले लेते. एंड देन शी कोट्स अ ब्यूटीफुल लाइन बाय सफ़ी लखनवी. आज दीवाना उड़ाता है जो वीराने की खाक, आज दीवाना उड़ाता है जो वीराने की खाक, कल उड़ाएगा यूं ही वीराना दीवाने की खाक. थैंक यू.
Thank you, Shahid. As always, a lovely lecture with a particularly moving conclusion. It's been a long lecture, but I would like the audience to also have a chance to ask Shahid a few questions. So maybe we could take a couple or three questions, if
Or done.
if you have the energy. Yeah, this question in the back. This question in the back. Yeah, please.
Sure. Hi.
Hello, thanks for your great lecture. I just have a small puzzle that I thought you might be able to throw light upon. Why is the jheel on the North Delhi ridge called Khuni Khan?
There's not much of a jheel there. Khuni jheel it is called. Khuni. I don't know why it's called. Perhaps it's I've I can't answer that question. I myself have been intrigued by that. Sorry, ask the forest development officer. I'm sorry, yeah, it's interesting. And now even that, it's very interesting to see the way rivers have been created over there, and they go into this lake. Unfortunately, some students were merrymaking, were drunk, and one person got drowned there about 6-7 years ago. So now the lake has been walled, and the little narrow drain, मोरी सी है, उसमें सब रिवर्स जाके फिर झील में जा रही हैं. रिवर तो 3 है, 2 दिखाई देती हैं, 1 नहीं दिखाई देती. गंगा, जमुना, सरस्वती भी है, और तीनों जाके उसमें लेक में एक मोरी से अंदर चली जा रही हैं. नॉर्मली व्हेन द लेक एक बड़े पानी में विलीन होती है तो चौड़ा पार्ट होता है. यहाँ पे बिल्कुल ही बहुत ही नैरो उसमें वो जा रही हैं. दैट इज आई थिंक खूनी लेक है कि खूनी खां है. खूनी खां तो नाम ठीक होना नहीं चाहिए. यस प्लीज.
You were mentioning that the Flagstaff road is no longer called a Flagstaff. Flagstaff road is no longer called a
Sure.
Flagstaff road, but the Chief Minister's office, if you ask them what is the address of the residence, and maybe it's also there on the website as 6 Flagstaff Road. So could you...
Perhaps the house is called 6 Flagstaff Road, but the road is not called that. Yeah, there are places like that.
No, they said the address is number 6 Flagstaff Road.
Well, yeah, it's a kind of a residual, but...
It's a bit like Connaught Place, still hanging around.
Yeah, it's not like Connaught Place, yeah. Yeah, Delhi College, I'm glad that now a compromise formula has been arrived at. It became Zakir Hussain College. Now it's called Zakir Hussain Delhi College.
Yeah.
Sir, after 1911, so many social places comes up in Delhi, like Bengali Club, Gymkhana Club, and various other social spaces where generally elite people used to go, the bureaucrats, then officers, naval, army officers. And many entertainment sites also comes up, like new cinema halls developed in 30s, 40s and 50s. You haven't mentioned any one of them.
That's correct. For the Bengali Club, read Mukul Keshav's novel. It's got a beautiful, and also Verma and Company, the leather people. No, it's little, I rue Robin Talkies, which is no longer there in Sabzi Mandi, because they had an absolutely brilliant arrangement to tackle black. They basically stamped your palm. There was no ticket. So you do this haath andar chale jao. So obviously, you couldn't really, sell it to anybody else. So, so that's what sticks in my mind from the early 60s. But of course, Minerva has gone, which is near the Genuine Parts Market, near Ambedkar University.
One thing more.
एक पूछा बस, एक.
Mention one thing about Guar Hall, because I am living in a hostel, so I am wondering. Mention one thing about Guar Hall in our class. कि कुछ किस्सा था Guar Hall से जुड़ा आपको याद?
अरे यार तो क्लास तो खत्म हो गई कब. मैं 2 साल हुए रिटायर हो गया यार. आपका सवाल पहले पूछना था. Guar Hall कोई किस्सा. Hi Jill.
Hi Shahid. Thanks for a lovely lecture. First of all, you must have heard it, there's a lovely interview with one of the conspirators, actually in Cambridge University, in which he describes one of the things that they did was to spirit out there was a pass under which Bhagat Singh got into the assembly, and so that they would never know who had given the pass to get him into the assembly, he was the one who spirited out the pass. According to him, and they were also building bombs in Old Delhi in some lavatory company. I couldn't find the name of the company. It was something to do with lavatories. They had a very good sense of humor also. And that was in
This is the Delhi conspiracy case.
This is the same one. This is one of the
accused. For 2.5 years and cost a lot of money, and then basically they wound up the case. Yeah,
because they were told in the beginning that it was untellable by one of the lawyers who said you're never going to get a conviction. Still, they did it. And what I wanted to ask you was, what happened to our river? In 1880s, there's a picture of Humayun's tomb showing the river behind the river, behind Humayun's Tomb in its old channel. Who stole our river? Who moved the river?
The railways must have done a bit of it.
Yeah, you think they channelized it, or?
This is the river, man.
Yeah, you get the impression of the river moving away, partly because of the vegetation cover. But the river near Humayun's tomb actually never moved further away at this juncture, largely because underneath the Humayun's tomb what you have is a rock spur of the Aravallis. That is what is turning the river away. So the Humayun's tomb, for instance, doesn't sit on sand, it sits on rock, quite unlike the Taj. So that's the natural barrier which is pushing the river away. And it doesn't move away that dramatically immediately, but over a period of time just sand fills up. So we are under the impression, of course, that it's moved away yards from the Humayun's tomb, but it hasn't actually. And it's Barapul, the Mughal Barapul, that gives you a sense of the extent to which the river has moved eastwards. I had a different question for you, Shahid, just perhaps as a way of conclusion. In your end, you made this point about how, for you as a historian, and I'm wondering if it might be true for many other people in the profession, 1984 seems to have played a dramatic role in the way in which we think of our history, because now, for example, we talk a lot about history and memory. And we especially, and this is not just postmodernism that has crept into our trade, we talk now about history and memory and about how we shouldn't get into facticity. And I was just wondering if 1984 and what it did to our city and the memories and recollection, and especially also of the readings back into 47 that came up in around 84, if that had a lot to do with the way historians looked at their discipline, perhaps you yourself, I mean, because for in your work, memory gets to be important.
Yeah, I think this is for, we didn't live through 47. And an earlier generation lived through 47, either talked about it or didn't talk about it. That's the whole, basis and point about the other side of silence. But it's interesting that Urvashi writes that book when she does. And 84 is very important for almost all of us. There's a beautiful piece by Amitav Ghosh, how he is actually teaching at the Delhi School of Economics and takes the bus past All India Institute of Medical Sciences to his friend Hari Sen's house, and what happens over there. There was a kind of fatedness. You remember, my father used to say this, that when Gandhi was shot, the first thing that Nehru did was to go on the All India radio, said, "Ek Musalman ne nahi mara hai." That was the smartest thing that Nehru thought he should be doing. And there was a certain fatedness. I remember when I was getting my scooter repaired by the Malkaganj red light opposite Hansraj College. And it said that she has been shot dead. I don't know whether they mentioned who had shot her dead and so on. And let me own this up. And I immediately said, oh, well, that particular shop belonged to so-and-so. Let me go and get my stuff from there. So there's a certain, this is that late afternoon, early evening. So because it's the partition riot that was there, that you realize now something like this has happened, there's going to be. And I just want to tell this story, which I didn't put it in the paper. And we were living in St. Stephen's College, and I went up and I saw, people looting things and running away, and smoke rising. And then I walked towards the back of St. Stephen's College, and I saw the taxi stand which used to be at Ramjas College burned. And there used to be a back passage from St. Stephen's College towards the arts faculty. And I went to Dwivedi Saab, and we went straight to Jeet Oberoy's house, because that was the next place after the taxi stand. And he came and stayed at Dwivedi Saab's house for 3 or 4 days. And I remember being with Dwivedi Saab when we came out, and that left a very, very, deep impression. I didn't see the violence, or the fact that some of us came to meet I.K. Gujral, who used to live in Maharani Bagh. There were tanks at the corner of Maharani Bagh, and that big Gurdwara on the road that leads to Escort was completely gutted. So I think, these, even for those who did not, like Urvashi, who did not really work in the refugee camps, though there was a big refugee camp in civil lines at that model school, just the whole geography of the place had completely changed, and almost the inevitability of this violence was really something that really completely changed the idea of space for a lot of us.
Well, thank you. I mean, it actually goes back to the topic of your talk very, very well. So without further ado, may I call this evening to an end, and many thanks, Shahid.
Thank you. Thank you. I just thought that I'll bring what happens next to IIC.
Yeah. Keep doing that.